Imagine a world where desire was policed, pleasure was punished, and the human body became a battleground for power and shame. The Middle Ages, often romanticized as a time of chivalry and piety, harbored some of the most shocking sexual practices in history. This was an era where the church and feudal lords dictated not just how people worshipped, but how they loved, lusted, and even suffered for it. Take the so-called trial by orgasm. In some medieval courts, a woman accused of witchcraft or infidelity was subjected to a grotesque test. If she could climax, it was proof of her guilt. Authorities believed a witch could control her pleasure, while an innocent woman could not. Imagine the humiliation, forced stimulation in front of leering judges, her body treated as evidence. If she moaned, she burned. If she stayed silent, she might still be condemned for defiance. Then there were the penitentials, strict church manuals that micromanaged marital sex, positions, frequency. Even the thoughts in your head during intimacy could land you in confession for weeks. Missionary in the dark for procreation only. Anything else risked damnation. Some priests demanded husbands abstain for 40 days after a child's birth. Violate these rules, and penance might involve fasting, flogging, or public shaming. And what of the rite of the first night? The myth persists that feudal lords claimed the right to bed brides before their husbands. While historians debate its prevalence, the terror was real. For peasant women, the threat of rape by their lord loomed like a shadow over their wedding night. Resistance could mean ruin, or worse. Behind convent walls, nuns, sworn to celibacy, sometimes broke their vows in secret. When discovered, punishments were brutal. Some were walled alive in tiny cells, left to starve in silence. Others were whipped raw, their bodies made examples of divine wrath. The Middle Ages didn't just punish sex, it weaponized it. From bestiality trials that ended in public burnings to the church's uneasy tolerance of brothels. As a necessary evil, this was a time when desire was both sin and spectacle. The legacy, a darkness that still lingers in our deepest shames and fears. This was an era where pleasure was pain, where love was law, and where the body was never truly your own. And the echoes of that control, they've never fully faded. Imagine a device so cruel, so dehumanizing, that it stripped a person of their dignity, their autonomy, and even their basic humanity, all under the guise of morality. The chastity belt, a symbol of control, jealousy, and medieval paranoia. But was it real, or just a myth exaggerated by history? The truth is more disturbing than fiction. While popular culture often treats chastity belts as a dark joke, something out of a bawdy medieval farce, evidence suggests they were indeed used, though not as widely as legend claims. The earliest reliable references appear in 15th century texts, describing iron contraptions designed to protect a woman's virtue in her husband's absence. But let's be clear, this was never about protection, it was about possession. The belts themselves were brutal. Iron bands lined with leather, supposedly to prevent chafing, clamped around the waist and between the legs, secured with locks only the husband or guardian held the key to. Some had narrow openings for bodily functions, but these were often deliberately designed to cause discomfort, even pain, ensuring the wearer couldn't ignore their confinement. Infections, sores, and psychological torment were inevitable. But here's the grim reality. Most surviving examples in museums are likely fakes, crafted in the 19th century to titillate audiences fascinated by the barbarity of the past. Yet medieval medical texts and legal records mention their existence, often in cases of extreme marital distrust or punitive measures against adulterous women. The church, ever obsessed with female purity, turned a blind eye so long as it upheld the patriarchal order. And what of the men who enforced this? Crusaders, merchants, nobles, men who left for war or trade for months, even years. Their fear wasn't just infidelity, it was the loss of control. A woman's body was property, and the chastity belt was the lock. By the Renaissance, the device had faded into obscurity, replaced by subtler forms of oppression, but its legacy lingers, a stark reminder of how far societies will go to police desire, to punish autonomy, to turn flesh into a prison. The chastity belt may not have been as common as myth suggests, but its existence tells us everything about the fears that created it, and perhaps in some ways those fears haven't entirely disappeared. Imagine a courtroom where a woman's guilt or innocence wasn't decided by evidence, testimony, or reason, but by whether she could achieve orgasm in front of a panel of male judges. This was trial by orgasm, one of the most grotesque and misogynistic legal practices of the medieval era. The logic was as twisted as it was cruel. If a woman accused of witchcraft or infidelity failed to climax under examination, it was proof she was in league with the devil, because demons had supposedly stolen her capacity for pleasure. If she did climax, she was guilty of lust, a sin punishable by public whipping, imprisonment, or worse. There was no way to win. The examinations were anything but private. A woman would be stripped, prodded, and stimulated by midwives or even clerics, while officials watched for signs of demonic influence. Some records describe wooden devices used to provoke a reaction, medieval society's warped attempt at forensic science. The humiliation was the point. This wasn't justice. It was ritualized abuse disguised as divine judgment, and the consequences were deadly. In 15th century France, a peasant woman named Marguerite de Blois was accused of cursing a neighbor's livestock. When she didn't react during the examination, it was deemed proof of witchcraft. She was burned at the stake 3 days later. In Germany, a young widow named Elspeth Ockler confessed to adultery under torture after failing her trial, only for the court to later discover her accuser had lied. By then she'd been branded on the face and sentenced to life in a workhouse. The darkest irony. Many of these trials were overseen by the same church authorities who preached about the evils of female desire. They turned the female body into a battleground, where pleasure was both a crime and a test of purity, where biology became a death sentence. The practice faded by the 1600s, but its legacy didn't. For centuries after, women's bodies were treated as objects of suspicion, something to be controlled, punished, or dissected in the name of morality. And that's the real horror. This wasn't just medieval barbarism. It was a warning of what happens when power decides it has the right to legislate desire. Imagine a wedding night, but not yours. The groom waits outside, humiliated. The bride trembles in bed, forced. And the lord of the land takes what he claims is his right. This is the infamous droit du seigneur, the so-called right of the first night. The idea that medieval lords had the legal privilege to sleep with a vassal's bride before her husband could. A brutal power play disguised as tradition. But was it real? Or just a dark fantasy used to vilify the nobility centuries later? Let's strip away the myth. The concept appears in medieval literature, folklore, and even legal texts, but concrete evidence is scarce. No surviving court records, no first-hand accounts from victims, no lord's diary proudly documenting his right. Most historians agree it was likely more propaganda than practice. A way for peasants to resent their overlords, for rival nobles to smear each other, for the church to paint feudal lords as tyrants. But that doesn't mean it never happened. Power corrupts, absolutely. Some lords did exploit their position. Rape wasn't a crime if the victim was a peasant and the perpetrator a noble. And the fear of such violation, that was real. The mere rumor of the droit du seigneur kept women terrified, husbands powerless. A psychological weapon as effective as any blade. The church condemned it, not out of morality, but because it challenged their authority over marriage. Kings banned it when it suited them. Yet the legend persisted, woven into stories, operas, even Hollywood films. Because the truth is sometimes worse than fiction. Even if the right wasn't law, the threat of it shaped lives. So ask yourself, does it matter if it was codified? When fear is enough to control, when silence is complicity, when power goes unchecked, the line between myth and reality blurs, and history remembers not just what was done, but what was believed could be done. The convent walls were meant to keep the world out, and the desires of the nuns in. But behind the solemn chants and veiled faces, medieval nunneries hid scandals that would make even the most jaded aristocrat blush. These were not just isolated incidents of weakness, they were eruptions of human longing in a system designed to crush it. Take the case of Sister Margaretha, a 14th century nun in a German abbey. She wasn't some rebellious outsider. She was devout, disciplined, and from a noble family. But when a young scribe was hired to illuminate manuscripts for the convent, something broke inside her. The way he lingered over the vellum, the way his fingers brushed hers when passing a quill, it was enough to unravel a lifetime of piety. Their affair was discovered when a novice, jealous of Margaretha's closeness to the scribe, reported hearing whispers after Compline. The punishment was brutal, but not for the reasons you might think. The church couldn't afford a public scandal. Nunneries were lucrative, funded by wealthy families who paid handsomely to keep their daughters pure. So instead of a trial, Margaretha was walled alive in a narrow cell within the convent itself. Food was passed through a slit just wide enough for a bowl. No light, no human touch, just the distant echo of matins and lauds, a cruel reminder of the life she'd lost. But here's the truly chilling part. Records show she lived that way for 11 years. When the abbess finally ordered the cell unsealed, they found Margaretha's skeleton curled around a bundle of letters, illicit, unsent, written in her own blood on scraps of habit. The scribe, he'd been sent to a monastery in another diocese. He died of fever 2 years later, never knowing what became of her. This wasn't about sin, it was about control. Because for every Margaretha who was caught, dozens more nuns found ways to bend the rules. Secret trysts in the herb garden, notes hidden in prayer books, even the strategic illness that allowed a sister to be secluded in the infirmary, where the physician might visit after dark. The church knew. They always knew. But as long as the donations kept flowing and the scandals stayed quiet, they looked the other way, until they couldn't. The real horror isn't the acts themselves. It's the fact that these women were punished, not for being wicked, but for being human. And that's a sin no amount of penance could ever absolve. Imagine being told by the church exactly how, when, and why you could touch your own spouse down to the most intimate details. This was the reality for medieval couples under the penitentials, a series of shockingly strict religious manuals that dictated every aspect of marital intimacy. These weren't vague suggestions, they were rules enforced by confession, penance, and the looming threat of eternal damnation. The penitentials emerged as early as the 6th century, written by monks and bishops who believed even marital sex required rigid control. They listed sins in exhaustive detail, assigning specific punishments, days, weeks, or even years of fasting and prayer for breaking their codes. And what counted as a sin? Almost everything. Positions other than the missionary were forbidden. Sex during menstruation, pregnancy, or Lent, a sin. Enjoying pleasure too much, a sin. Even thinking about your spouse with too much desire outside of procreation could land you in spiritual trouble. The most extreme penitentials, like those of Theodore of Tarsus in the 7th century, treated the female body as a minefield of temptation. A husband who performed oral sex on his wife could face 7 years of penance, the same punishment as for homicide. If a woman dared to orgasm outside of strict procreative intent, she was accused of acting like a man, a grave violation of natural order. The church's obsession with controlling pleasure wasn't just about morality, it was about power. By regulating the bedroom, they regulated lives. But here's the cruel irony. These rules were impossible to follow. Couples were trapped in a cycle of guilt, confessing sins that were basic human needs. The penitentials didn't just dictate sex, they weaponized shame, turning love into something to be feared. And that shame echoes even today. The next time you hear someone claim the past was more moral, remember, morality in the Middle Ages was often just control in disguise. The air was thick with the stench of burning flesh, and the jeers of the crowd as the accused was dragged forward, not for murder, not for heresy, but for a crime that blurred the line between man and beast. Bestiality trials in the Middle Ages were not just about punishment, they were public spectacles of horror, designed to cleanse the community through blood and fire. Take the case of Michel Verdun, a peasant from 16th century France. His name survives not because of any great deed but because of the grotesque details of his trial. Accused of coupling with a cow, Verdun was subjected to an interrogation that mixed superstition with sadism. The church, wielding divine authority, declared such acts an abomination, a perversion of nature that demanded extermination. The trial itself was a farce of evidence. Witnesses claimed the animal behaved strangely, as if it recognized him. The cow was examined for signs of violation, then paraded before the court like a victim. Verdun, stripped naked, was beaten until he confessed. But confession wasn't enough. The law demanded annihilation. His execution was methodical. Bound to a stake, he was forced to watch as the cow, his alleged partner in sin, was slaughtered before him. Then the flames took him. The crowd didn't look away. They cheered as his screams turned to silence, as his body blackened and split. This wasn't justice. It was theater. A warning etched in agony. Cross the boundaries of nature, and you would burn. Afterward, his name was scrubbed from records where possible, reduced to a cautionary tale. The cow's carcass was buried in unconsecrated ground, as if even in death, the animal bore guilt. What lingers isn't just the brutality, but the hypocrisy. How easily fear turned neighbors into executioners. How readily faith justified cruelty. This wasn't an isolated case. Across Europe, animals were sometimes tried alongside their human accomplices, sentenced to death, as if they too possessed moral agency. The line between sinner and sin collapsed in the fire, and long after the ashes cooled, the message remained. Some transgressions demanded not just punishment, but eradication. So ask yourself, how thin is the veil between justice and vengeance? How quickly does disgust become violence? The past doesn't whisper these answers, it screams them. The air was thick with the stench of burning flesh, and the jeers of the crowd as she was dragged through the streets. Not a criminal, not a rebel, but a woman whose only crime was selling what the church both condemned and quietly permitted. Prostitution in the Middle Ages existed in a shadowy paradox. The church preached chastity, yet brothels thrived under its watch, often just steps away from cathedrals. Why? Because even holy men understood desire could not be extinguished, only controlled, and control in their eyes meant regulation. Brothels were licensed in cities like London, Paris, and Venice. Authorities taxed them. Bishops turned a blind eye, so long as the women were kept away from respectable society. But this uneasy tolerance came at a cost. Prostitutes were branded sinners, yet their labor was deemed a necessary evil to prevent worse sins: rape, adultery, sodomy. The church's logic was cold. Better a woman burn in hell for her trade than a man's soul be lost to uncontrollable lust. But the hypocrisy ran deeper. Many brothels were owned by the church itself, their profits funneled into ecclesiastical coffers. In Avignon, papal authorities openly ran houses of ill repute. In Southwark, London's red light district, bishops collected rents from the very women they condemned from the pulpit. And the women, they paid the price in flesh and blood. Stripped of legal protections, they could be beaten, raped, or murdered with little consequence. Some sought refuge in stews, bathhouses that doubled as brothels, where they were inspected for disease like livestock. Others were forced to wear distinctive clothing, striped hoods, yellow veils, marking them as outcasts. Yet even in this brutal system, some women carved out power. Madame Rosia of Paris, a famed 14th century brothel keeper, amassed enough wealth to lend money to nobles. But her success was rare. Most ended like Agnes, a prostitute in 15th century Germany, who was flogged through the streets before being banished, only to return, starving, to the only trade that would feed her. The church's stance was clear. Prostitution was a sin, but abolishing it was unthinkable. Because in the end, medieval morality wasn't about purity, it was about power. And nothing proves that more than the fact that the same men who damned these women to hell were the ones keeping the brothel doors open. Think on that the next time you hear of sacred morality. The past was never pure, it was just better at hiding its stains. The whip cracked against bare flesh, not as punishment, but as twisted devotion. In the dim candlelight of medieval monasteries and secret chambers, men and women sought absolution through pain, believing that the sting of the lash could purify desire itself. This was flagellation as erotic penance, a dark fusion of pleasure and piety that blurred the lines between sin and salvation. The church preached that the flesh was weak, a vessel of corruption. But some took this doctrine to extremes, wielding self-inflicted torment as a weapon against temptation. Monks stripped to the waist, their backs crisscrossed with scars, striking themselves with knotted cords until blood ran in rivulets down their spines. Women, cloistered in convents, pressed thorns into their skin to quell what they called the devil's whispers. The pain was meant to cleanse, but for some it became something else entirely. Records from the 14th century speak of penitents who moaned not in agony, but ecstasy. A Dominican confessor wrote of a noblewoman who demanded ever harsher discipline from her spiritual advisor, her breath quickening with each lash. When questioned, she claimed it was the only way to quiet her unholy thoughts. Others joined clandestine flagellant sex, where the line between mortification and arousal dissolved in the heat of collective frenzy. The very act meant to suppress desire had become its perverse accomplice. The church, of course, condemned such excesses, but quietly, because this was the hypocrisy at the heart of it all. The same institution that preached celibacy had fostered a culture where pain and pleasure intertwined. By the late Middle Ages, flagellant processions were banned, their followers denounced as heretics. Yet the practice persisted in shadows, a testament to the human capacity to twist devotion into obsession. What does it say about us that even repentance can become a vice? That the quest for purity so often leads back to the sins it seeks to destroy? The scars of those penitents have long faded, but the paradox remains. Imagine a world where preventing pregnancy wasn't just a private matter, it was a sin punishable by damnation. In the Middle Ages, the so-called sin of Onan, named after the biblical figure who spilled his seed to avoid conception, became the church's weapon against any attempt to control fertility. But desperate people still sought ways to avoid childbirth, and their methods were as dangerous as they were bizarre. Men and women resorted to potions made from mercury, pennyroyal, or even crushed beaver testicles, ingredients believed to induce sterility or miscarriage. Some swallowed these poisons willingly, knowing the risk: internal bleeding, organ failure, agonizing death. Others tied amulets of weasel pelts around their thighs, trusting in superstition over science. Midwives whispered of inserting sponges soaked in vinegar or lemon juice, a crude barrier that often led to infection. The most extreme, medieval manuscripts describe women drinking the blood of executed criminals, or lying over bowls of steaming water, mixed with herbs, hoping the vapors would expel unwanted life. These weren't just ineffective, they were torture, and the church watched closely. Confessors interrogated women about lost pregnancies, and a suspicious miscarriage could brand a woman a murderer. The legacy? Centuries of suffering under the shadow of doctrine, where the fear of hell outweighed the fear of pain. These weren't just misguided attempts, they were acts of survival in a world that punished control as fiercely as it punished sin. The air was thick with the smell of burning flesh and the jeers of the crowd as the executioner's iron glowed red hot. This was not just punishment, it was a spectacle, a warning to anyone who dared defy the rigid moral order of medieval Europe. And at the center of it all was a man whose only crime was love. His name was Richard, a scholar from Orleans, well-read, discreet, until whispers of his secret life reached the wrong ears. In a world where the church dictated every aspect of human desire, his relationships with other men were not just forbidden, they were considered an abomination, a sin that demanded the harshest possible retribution. The trial was a farce. No evidence was needed beyond rumor and the fevered accusations of men who saw heresy in every shadow. The sentence? Death by burning, the preferred method for those accused of sodomy, a punishment meant to cleanse the soul through agony. They dragged him through the streets naked, his body bruised from beatings, the crowd spitting and hurling stones. Some laughed, others crossed themselves, as if his very presence was a curse. When they tied him to the stake, he did not beg. He did not renounce his love. He simply stared at the flames as they licked closer, his final defiance etched in silence. When it was over, there was no grave, no memorial. His name was struck from records, his books burned alongside him. But fire does not erase truth, it only scatters the ashes. And in those ashes, the echoes of his story remain. A grim reminder of what happens when fear dictates justice. Ask yourself, how many more were lost to the same flames, their stories forgotten, their suffering justified in the name of righteousness? The past does not forgive, it only waits for us to remember. The air was thick with the scent of burning herbs, mandrake root, crushed rose petals, and something darker, something forbidden. A woman, her hands trembling, stirred the bubbling liquid in a small clay pot, whispering words that slithered between prayer and curse. This was no mere remedy. This was erotic magic, the kind that could bind a lover's will or twist desire into obsession. And in the shadows of the Middle Ages, such potions were as feared as they were sought. Love potions weren't just fantasy, they were deadly serious business. Apothecaries, midwives, and cunning women brewed them in secret, blending herbs, blood, and sometimes far worse. Some recipes called for menstrual blood mixed with wine. Others required the ashes of a dove's heart or the ground bone of an unbaptized child. The church called it sorcery, the desperate called it hope. But these potions weren't just about romance, they were weapons. A nobleman might slip one into a rival's drink to humiliate him. A scorned wife might use it to punish an unfaithful husband. And if the potion failed, the consequences were brutal. In 1324, the Irish noblewoman Alice Kyteler was accused of using love magic to seduce and control men, a crime that sent her fleeing for her life while her servant Petronilla de Meath was burned alive. The most dangerous potions weren't just psychological. Some contained belladonna or hemlock, substances that could induce hallucinations, paralysis, or a slow, agonizing death. Victims might believe they were enchanted, not realizing their passion was just poison gnawing at their nerves. And if a lover died after drinking one, the maker would face the rack, the stake, or worse. Yet the demand never faded. Because desire in the Middle Ages was a force as dangerous as any blade, and those who dared to manipulate it walked a razor's edge between ecstasy and execution. The next time you hear a fairy tale about a love potion, remember this: behind every whispered spell there was blood, and for every heart won, another was broken, or stopped entirely. The legacy of medieval sexual taboos, Imagine a world where desire was policed by fire and scripture, where the church dictated not just how you prayed, but how you loved, how you touched, even how you thought about pleasure. The Middle Ages didn't just punish sin, they weaponized shame, embedding it so deeply into society that its echoes still reverberate today. Take the penitentials, those grim handbooks of acceptable intimacy. Priests interrogated couples about positions, frequency, even thoughts during sex. Pleasure was suspect. Anything beyond procreation risked damnation. These rules didn't just vanish with the Renaissance. They morphed. The obsession with female purity. The medieval church's fixation on virginity birthed centuries of control, from witch trials to Victorian-era hysteria over hysterical women. Then there's the persecution of homosexuality. In medieval Europe, sodomy wasn't just a crime, it was a blasphemy, punishable by burning. That terror didn't die with the Middle Ages. It seeped into laws, into pulpits, into the very language of morality. Even today, the shadow of those pyres lingers in places where love is still legislated by ancient fears. And what about the droit du seigneur, the myth of the Lord's right to a bride's first night? Whether real or exaggerated, the idea exposed a brutal truth. Power has always sought to claim the body. That legacy didn't end with feudalism. It evolved into dowries, into marital rape exemptions, into the quiet centuries-long theft of agency. The darkest irony? The church's own scandals. Nunneries turned secret brothels. Priests flagellating themselves into erotic ecstasy proved hypocrisy was baked into the system. That too is a legacy we inherit. The gap between preached morality and practiced cruelty. Medieval Europe didn't just fear sex, it feared freedom. And in that fear it built a cage of guilt we're still rattling. The question isn't whether we've moved past those taboos, it's how much of them we still carry.